Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Rock Your Shine After You've Been Cracked Wide Open. I am super excited about my guest this week. I have with me Jordon Ferber. He is a stand-up comedian, a podcaster, and a bereaved sibling. Jordon's brother Russell was killed in a car accident on July 6th of 2002 at the age of 21. Since then, Jordon has worked to become a much-needed voice in the bereavement community. Currently, he is the co-leader and facilitator of the Compassionate Friends Manhattan Siblings Group, and he has been doing this now for the past decade. Jordon is a unique public speaker and producer of Where's the Grief, a podcast with mostly comedians who have experienced tragic loss. He and his family run the Russell Ferber Foundation, which provides scholarships to the Culinary Institute of America. He produces a yearly comedy benefit show for the foundation, continuing to bring people together and carry on the spirit of his brother Russell through love and laughter. In his spare time, Jordon enjoys writing short blurbs about himself in the third person. Jordon, welcome to the show. I'm very
Yeah, thank you.
excited to have you.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to have all of your links in the show notes because I, of course, now that I was having you as a guest, I had to go watch you on YouTube and watch your
Uh-huh.
stand up, which is just was a blast. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank
So,
you.
so why don't we start with your story?
Yeah,
Let's talk about your brother Russell, what happened, and then we'll dive right into your grief journey. So please take it
yeah.
away.
So my brother Russell, he was just about to graduate from the Culinary Institute of America from the CIA with a degree in the pastry baking arts. When he was in a car accident on July 6, 2002, it was the Saturday morning of July 4th weekend. We're not even really sure where he was going, but he was hit by a milk truck at about 7:30 in the morning and died pretty instantly. And I was on vacation in Florida at the time. I was down in Fort Myers Beach, Florida on vacation, and my parents were up in Vermont. I think my parents got the call from police around noonish, and I didn't find out till about 10 o'clock at night. I
And
found out at 10.
how old were you at that time?
I was 24.
You were And is it just the two of you, just
It
you and
was
your
just the
brother?
two of us. Yep. So now it's just me.
Yeah. So you get this
And
call, and I'm imagining you and your brother, did you guys have a close relationship?
we were very close. Yeah. Yeah, we were very close. Well, so I was on vacation. I was on a beach. This was 2002. I didn't even have my phone with me. My phone was plugged in at the
And you're
house I was staying at.
24, you're out having a good time, right?
Yeah. We were out and about for the day. Didn't we weren't glued to our phones back then, so it was easier to just leave it plugged in. I got back to the house at 10 o'clock at night, and I had 25 messages on there or something. I started listening to a couple of them. I listened to about, I don't know, two, maybe three before I realized, I should probably call somebody to figure out what's going on before I start listening to these messages, because there were a lot of messages. And so I called my dad, and he told me over the phone.
Yeah. So let's talk about that and what that looked like. I mean, here you were so young. It's just you and your brother. It was a super tragic accident, happened in just a blink of an eye. What was that experience like after? What did that look like for you and your family?
Oof. Well, I mean, it was pretty bad. I mean, it's the worst thing that ever happened. The week before Russell died, my parents had just done the major demolition to renovate their kitchen. So they had no kitchen in their apartment. For the week that we were sitting Shiva, we had no kitchen, which, I guess it was good to have a lot of space for people to walk around in, I guess. And it was good that people were bringing us food, but we had a microwave and a fridge, and that
And
was it.
at this point in your life at 24, you've been doing comedy all of this time. Were you doing
I
stand-up?
was, yeah, I was well into my comedy career. I was almost just about 2 years into doing stand up.
So, and I know you and I, had the opportunity to talk before we actually recorded this episode. So I would love to delve into that because when we think the talks that I give, I often talk about what it means to hold joy and grief at the same time. However, when you are a stand-up, that is not really what I mean when I'm like, it's possible to hold joy and pain at the same time. And yet, as a comedian, and the importance of humor in your life. Because I asked you, did you quit stand up? And of course, we know that you did not, that you've had a very long career. Did you take a break from it? And how did you use your stand up to help you work through the grief of your brother?
Right. Well, so the very first conversation I had with my dad, when I called my dad and spoke to him, and he told me that Russell had died in this accident, he asked me if I had any idea what kind of cake Russell would have, what kind of funeral Russell would have wanted. If I knew if he wanted to be cremated, if what kind of service he might have wanted. I said I have no idea. All I know is that the cake afterwards has to be amazing. 'Cause he was a pastry chef. I mean, you got to have good cake.
No, I'm right. You're right. That's so wonderful.
So even
Um,
right off the bat, I was, kind of reminding myself, I think, looking back, the fact that I had a joke in that moment was pretty impactful for me to think back on. And then I did take a break, I guess. I had about, I don't know, 2 weeks or so. So I about let's see, Russell died July 6th. About a month after he died, I had a show planned at Madison Square Garden. I was hooked up with this group that at the time was called Comedy Gone Wild, and they had booked two shows at Madison Square Garden that I was going to be on. The first one was in June, and Russell came to that show, and then he died in July, and the second one was supposed to be in August. So, I sold about 30 tickets to the show in June, and then I didn't really know what else to do with myself. I was selling tickets at the Shiva for the August show. That was people were like, "Is there anything I can do?" I was like, "Well, I got a big show coming up, Madison Square Garden." I sold about 130 tickets to the second show. So, having a show like that on the calendar was a great motivator to figure out what the hell I was going to do with myself. I remember I went to a show that a friend of mine was hosting, and for just 2 hours, totally forgot about my own problems. And that was a great reminder for what the power of stand-up comedy is, for what, the power of just taking a break from myself for a couple hours to sit and just laugh about somebody else's problems.
so let's talk about that then, that show that you did in August, because that was the first show. Was that the first time you were doing any type of show and standing up in front of anybody after your
No,
brother's death, or did you do other small gigs?
I had a couple of other smaller gigs to try to get ready for that show because I was really afraid that I wasn't going to be able to perform. I did one show and I was very drunk. I didn't really give it. I really didn't care. I was just sort of going through the motions. And one of the guys that I was on the show with at the Garden had a connection to this other club near Times Square that I was able to get 3 spots in a night at. I had to hand out flyers in Times Square for an hour beforehand, before each show, but I got to go up 3 times, and I think that was about a week or so before that Garden show. I did a few nights at that club, and then after that show, I worked at that club for a few years, where I was doing like 20 shows a week there. It was important to me to get a couple of sober sets under my belt so that I could remind myself what the hell I was doing.
Right. So I'm interested in, what did that look like for you? Was your comedy a way to compartmentalize this this unimaginable traumatic event that happened in your family, or did you incorporate what happened with your brother into your show? What did that look like for
Oh,
you?
it took a long time before I started talking about this on stage at all. Really, I've often talked about how I felt like I was leading a double life for a while because I was like, living with my parents still. I was still living at my parents' house. And so, going from that to go to do comedy every night, it was two different worlds, really. I was able to talk about it with other comedians, a lot of the other comics that I was working with on a nightly basis after that. I became very close with, and I was able to be open with a number of them about what I was dealing with. But I really did not talk about it on stage at all. Certainly, those first few sets and that show at the Garden all of them were very, I would say, mechanical in a sense. I didn't feel connected to the material at all. It was really, just keeping my head above water. It's like just going through the motions to sort of to do it.
That's what I was going to ask you. Here you are in comedy, and I've been a therapist for 30 years. And after my brother died, that's what I did. I trained therapists around the country. I mean, this is the work that I did. And here I was in this, and it's that same feeling of there's such a deep disconnect. And how can I offer, how do I have anything to offer when I'm so broken? And I think that what was so profound when I talked to you is how can you possibly be dealing with this trauma and be up and stand up and do comedy? Like, to me, there was such a juxtaposition between those two. It's like, how
Yeah,
do you do that? And I
right.
think that what you just said, that you weren't connected to the material, what does that look like? I mean, you're performing, you're up there, in front of people trying to make them laugh, and you've got this thing looming over you of this trauma that you've just sustained that you probably haven't even taken in completely yet. How, and I mean, that's true compartmentalization, right? When you're doing comedy and you're leaving comedy and you're what, getting drunk or going home and crying. I mean, I don't know, what were you doing? How were you melding these two worlds? I know you said they felt separate to you, but what did that look like?
Well, yeah, I was definitely living in the bottom of a bottle at the end of the night, for sure. I was drinking a lot. The club that I worked at was on 46th Street. There was a bar up the block, an Irish bar that at 3:30 would lock their doors and would stay open till 6:30. So you could get a fair amount of drinking done.
So you would
Um,
drink, you'd stumble home, pass out, get up, and just go do it again. And so you were
yep.
just sort of being that robot, right? Just sort of. And then what was going on with your parents? Because at 24, I know that when my brother died, I was in my 40s and I felt this incredible need to take care of my parents. You were still living with your parents.
Right.
What were you doing? Were you just trying to do everything you could to avoid that whole situation? What did that look
No,
like for
I don't know.
you?
So my parents started going to the Compassionate Friends, the support group,
Right away, right
right
away.
away. I think it was 3 weeks after Russell died that they started going to that meeting. And they kept telling me, oh, they have a siblings group. And I kept putting it off and off. I was like, yeah, whatever. Because that's not going to be my thing. I'm not going to be a guy that goes to these groups, you know. I don't know. I think we talked about it, those that first year is definitely a bit of a haze. I remember it more as snapshots than I do
Yeah.
as full memories.
I'm
But
sorry to interrupt you, but it has dawned on me that even though you and I know compassionate friends too, I've written for their online. A lot of people might not know what that is. So let's back up for a moment
okay.
and explain who and what compassionate friends is, please.
So Compassionate Friends is an international organization. They have chapters all over the world. They have 500 local chapters around the U.S. They're a self-help support group for people who have lost a child, a grandchild, or a sibling. There are no professionals there. We're all just people that are there to share, to talk about what we go through. And the irony of it is I've often talked about the irony of it, that my parents kept telling me that there was a siblings group, and eventually I went, mostly to get them to shut up about it. That was my
And, and
goal in
and
going
and
to
and
this.
how long after Russell died did you finally go to your first group?
The first group I went to was in December of that year, so it was about 5 months after Russell died, and it took about a good year after that before I started going on the regular. I would say maybe even longer. But
What?
but but initially, I like I say, my reason for going in the first place was to get my parents to shut up about it. I
Mhm.
figured I'd go, it wouldn't be helpful, and we'd never have to talk about it again. And now I run it, and they don't come.
So talk to us about that because I know, we've talked a lot about different things that have helped people in their grieving process, and groups are not for everyone. And I would love to hear, and I ran groups for years at the Center for Grieving Children, and the majority of people that came, other than children, were female, right? And so I would love to hear from you. You went,
Always more women at these groups than men, for sure.
and what did you find helpful? What was the turning point for you?
Well, really, I mean, I think first of all, I'm sure you know this as well, but when you lose a sibling, nobody really asks about how you're doing ever. It's always, how is your parents? How is your mother? Oh my God, your parents must be devastated. That's the worst. You got to stay, you got to be strong for them now. It's like, oh, there's a thousand and one things that people say to you that essentially dismiss the fact that you're also going through the worst thing of your life. So just having a place where my pain and my struggle was acknowledged as a real thing was very helpful. Nobody else really understood what it was like to be, because even people that try to be there for you, that try to be helpful, that try to be, for some reason, people want to come up with some sort of quick fix or some sort of, platitude that lets them off the hook of having to listen to it anymore. I don't know, for whatever reason, people try to come up. Well, there's anything that comes after the phrase "well, at least" is totally unhelpful. But people don't know that. Well, at least you have this, at least you have that. Like, well, yeah, but just having a place where I could talk about, the issues that I was dealing with my parents, how hard it was I felt like I was 10 years old again, in a sense. My parents, like I had to ask permission to cross the street. My parents were
Yeah.
super protective of losing another child. So they were very overprotective in a lot of ways, overbearing. And, I had to set up a system where if I knew I wasn't going to be home by the time I had told him I had to leave a message with my dad on my dad's cell phone or something so that he didn't get up in the middle of the night and worry. All these little
Right.
things, a lot of little things like that. But just having a place where I could talk about what I was going through and people understood that it was a thing, that we didn't have any answers. But it was good to have the problems be acknowledged as real things. That was sort of the biggest thing for me was,
That acknowledgement, right? Just that,
yeah.
yeah. So what did that end up looking like then? How did you start to integrate your brother's loss into the second half of your life? And what I mean by that, I don't mean like the second half age-wise, I mean the second half of your life, meaning career.
Right.
When did you feel like, and I love what you said about living in two worlds, because I don't know if we've ever talked about it just that way on this podcast, where you really are, then you've got people that have children, and like, and you're trying to compartmentalize all of these worlds and find space for your grief. And then at some point we move from grief to mourning, and mourning is really when we start to integrate and have coping strategies, because we are in it for the long haul, right? You're
Hmm.
never going to have Russell again, never going to have Rocky again. What does that really look like, that integration? What did that look like for you?
Well, so I'm trying to think, it was a couple of years in that I really started to embrace going to the Compassionate Friends, the TCF. My mom became the chapter leader, and they did the facilitator training in our apartment. So it was really hard to get out of going to that. And at that point, I was already sort of unofficially facilitating the sibling groups because there wasn't. I was the most consistent participant, I guess.
So you
Um,
kind of took that role on. You kind of took that role on because, hey, I'm the one that shows up every week,
I
right?
took that role on because someone needs to do it. I found it so helpful to me that I was like, if I stop showing up and then there's no group, like that's, won't be here when I need it.
That's awesome.
And like I said, I was talking to other comedians off stage. I found that the freedom of talking about it with other bereaved people started to give me a vocabulary to talk about it. And just talking with other comedians about anything, comedians are really good at just talking at length about anything or nothing. But in particular, even without the jokes, you can get some really deep conversations. And most comedians have been through some sort of trauma. We don't get up there bearing our soul to an audience because we're well adjusted. I mean, I had a pretty happy childhood. I got lots of hugs and love, but I don't know how I turned into somebody that needed this much external validation. But that's a totally separate issue. I
Well,
mean,
it's actually not, right, because you got the therapist, we got the comedian and the therapist. It's perfect combo, because all of us, whenever we are, a lot of my work that I teach, that, whenever we're triggered, we all have childhood traumas. Every single one of us do. It can be from the kid who stole our lunch in the lunchroom, to losing somebody very early on, right? It runs the gamut. But the point is that, as spiritual beings, as energetic beings, we hold these things in we hold these, they become energetic blocks. And
Hmm.
then these things happen and we get triggered and we don't know why. We're like, why am I having this response? And so comedy is one of those areas where, I'm a writer too, right? So I can write about things. We all have our ways to work out the things, and yours is comedy. And that's what I
Yeah.
love most about comedy. My brother and I talk about this all the time. Comedians are so funny because you talk about these everyday occurrences, and you bring humor to the pain that we all live
Hmm.
through in our lives. And that's why I find it, because one area that I have really had a lot of interest in is infusing humor into the grief and loss process to bring some levity to that constant, relentless heartache, whether you're going to watch Lucille Ball or do something to bring laughter, because a lot of people feel guilt in laughing after they've had a loss, like they're
Right.
betraying. And that's why I find your story so fascinating, that you were able to maintain your career in comedy really from very early on, right? A month after your brother's
Well, I
death.
mean, listen, I wanted to do stand up since I was like 9 years old. So
Mhm.
I'm not trained to do anything else. I don't have any other skills. I have, I'm stuck with this now, I can't.
So did you find, because you started to bring your brother into your comedy, right? Did that
Well,
ever
it
happen?
took a long time. I really didn't, I had one incident where one comedian I knew sort of forced me to do a joke about it on stage once because it's sort of this guy Rick Shapiro, he's talked about this incident in a few other venues as well, so he's owned up to it. But he's had a lot of issues. Rick, he was a drug addict for many many years, and he cleaned himself up, and he was on Louis C.K.'s HBO show and
I was
on
going to
his
say that name sounds so familiar to me, but I
yeah.
don't.
There was a period of time where he was very big in the East Village comedy scene. They called him the James Joyce of stand-up. He did a lot of sort of stream of consciousness, very fast. He had a lot of really dark material. I was doing a show once where I was with him, and it was a really small audience, and he was sort of in the back after his set doing some pantomime stuff, making fun of the bartender, and he was getting bigger laughs in the back from the other comics than I was from the audience. So I made a joke. I go, "Oh, I'm always happy when Rick Shapiro's here, because whenever I'm working with him and I feel like my career is not going the way I would like it to be, at least I can take comfort in the fact that I haven't been failing for it as long as he has." And he jumped out from behind the bar and goes, "Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, at least my brother didn't die."
Oh,
And I was like, "Yeah, well, this is awkward. The holidays are coming up, which is really awkward at my house because my brother just died. Now we have that
yeah.
empty seat at the table, which only comes in handy during Passover."
It's funny.
Yeah. Although I came up with an even better joke in retrospect. In retrospect, I should have said, when he said, "At least my brother didn't die," I should have said, "Jealous," because he has an identical twin brother and they do not get along.
So did that become more a part of your show intentionally?
No, it took a long time even before I really started talking about it on stage. I think it was because it was hard. It's one thing like I first of all I didn't want to force the material. I felt like it was, these are not just like dick jokes. These are not throwaway jokes. So I really was. I had some jokes. I wrote some things, or I came up with things that I would say here and there in my meetings, in my support group meetings, things like that, where I would say, I would tell a story about how, like, little things people would say, "Oh, come to my birthday party, but don't be like the weird crying guy at the end of the bar." And I was like, "Well, do you want me to come or not?"
Well,
Things like that. But the thing was, it was hard to figure out where the context for that type of material would come from in a regular club set. How do you broach that topic without going all the way in, before dragging the entire audience with you into a dark hole? It's
so
like,
how
so
how did you do that? Like, how did
I
you?
had one. I started with one joke, and then I kind of built on top of it. The first joke I would say is, I would say I've been, I don't know, I'd say like I lost my brother. It's a hard thing to talk about. I tell audiences all the time. Oh, no. The first way I would say was that we're very bad as a society at taking advice. We're very good at giving advice, but we're not very good at taking advice. But here's one piece of advice I feel pretty confident in giving you. I tell this to people all the time. I go to a support group for bereaved siblings, and that is a great sentence that you can use if you ever need to get out of a conversation.
And
It's usually followed by me being alone with my thoughts again. You're welcome.
no, no, and I love that because, I had this. I run a lot of, I've been run a lot of bereavement groups and really thinking about, I work with a lot of parents too who've lost a kid, which is ironic as hell because I do not have children, which also I think can be helpful because I don't have that personal experience of like
Right.
loss of a child, but I can only look at it through the lens of a sibling with parents who were so bereft and I
Hmm.
just did not know what to do about it. But I remember and I shared this with you that I know that laughter can raise vibration, and grief is such a very dense vibration that when we allow ourselves to laugh, that idea of holding joy and grief at the same time, we are giving ourselves a pause, a moment to breathe, a moment to get out of that very dark energy that,
Yeah.
that process is very different for everyone. The length of time, when do you go get help, all of the things. And and an idea that I had had was to start a group and having them think about the funniest thing that they can remember about their sibling, because immediately it brings them into a space of a memory that they can really enjoy. Because early on, as you know, it's very difficult for any memory to be enjoyable. You just feel like a knife
Right.
goes through your heart every 2 seconds, right? Like you
Right.
can't,
Yeah.
I couldn't even tolerate looking at pictures of my brother. I mean, at first I was immersed. I couldn't get enough of the pictures. But then after that shock wore off, it was a while before I could actually hold his photograph and really look at his photograph. Again, it's just part of that process. So I'm curious, I have a couple of questions with you because you were living with your parents at this time. You
Right.
were still doing comedy. What was going on? What was the dynamic between you and your parents?
Well, like I said before, I felt like I was 10 years old again. I
Right,
was
they had
really,
to follow you, but how did you feel? Did you feel, I mean, because you were so young, did you feel that you had to like somehow be you and your brother Russell at the same time? I've heard that a lot from people where there's only two siblings. Like, what was your experience?
yeah, no, I did not feel that at all. I didn't feel like I had to do, I don't know. I definitely, the minute that I saw my parents, I flew up to New York after Russell died. As soon as I got off the plane and saw my parents, the very first thing I said to them was, we've always been a strong family. We're going to continue to be a strong family. And I felt like we really needed, like it needed to be said out loud for us to recognize that we needed each other to get through this. That we were definitely going to need each other for sure. So, I mean, we gave each other a lot of space. Like I said, because my parents went to TCF right away, they were hyper aware of the fact that my experience was different but parallel. And so they were not at all insistent that I do things a certain way or the same way that they were doing it. They understood that I was on my own timeline of things. So we were very respectful of each other. The one thing that we did together after Russell died was we started smoking pot together. They were both big potheads for
I'm
most of my
sorry.
life.
I love this so much. I have no words. Okay, keep
Yeah.
going.
Apparently they were big potheads for most of my life. And my brother and I found my mom's pot once when we were like teenagers, and we took it, and we were never questioned about it because that would have
That
been an admission on her part.
that is the
When Russell had been out in the Hamptons, his friends brought his bag of things in, and there was a giant bag of pot. Me and his friends went into the back. We rolled up all these joints. We started smoking one. We came out. My mom goes, "Oh, that smells delicious. I would love a toke of that." So I brought my mom a full joint.
and that is the first time you knew that your mother smoked weed?
Hold on. I brought my mom a full joint, and she goes, "No, don't you have one that's already open?" Which is, pretty hilarious by
No, that
itself.
is, you don't really think of a joint as being open.
Yeah. So we knew that my mom smoked pot because when Russell and I started smoking pot, we were pretty open about it with our parents because I knew so many people who had smoked pot when they were in high school, and they went through, like, they had to jump through all these sorts of hoops and like all this secrecy to try to sneak around and get out of the house to go smoke pot. And it's like, I don't want to have to do that. They're gonna find my parents. My parents aren't stupid. They're gonna find out eventually. So I might as well just tell them up front, so I have a safe place to smoke pot.
No, I love you. That's so great. And that too,
So,
I just want to say
but
one thing about that
but
before
we
you
didn't know that
go.
my dad smoked pot
Oh no.
yeah, when we were when we when we when I was with my brother's friends and we passed that joint to my mom, she passed it to my dad, and my dad said no. My mom said, "Oh, this was Russell's pot." He goes, "Oh, it's Russell's pot. I'll have a toke." And that was the first time that I ever knew that my dad smoked pot.
Well, what I was going to say is that this is the other thing, that I talk a lot about is how, depending on how close families are, a death can either fracture families or bring them closer together. And and so it just sounds like you guys had such a close family, and that must have been, what's the word I want to use? Just such a saving grace
Hmm.
because siblings can feel so alone in their pain, and you actually were alone. You did not have another sibling to talk to. So did you and your parents talk openly about Russell? Did you guys share in your grief process? What was that like?
It was sporadic when we would share with each other like that, but we were pretty open with each other. We didn't, if we had a conversation with somebody else where they remembered it, we were very. I think we're still like that. We talk about when Russell things come up, we bring them up to each other.
So Russell is very much a part of, so because this is the way it is with my brother too. He's very much a part of your life, even though he's on the other side, right? He is
Yeah,
a part, yeah. And that makes a big difference, right? When you include, I mean, Rocky just is, I mean, for me, I talk to him all the time. Like I have a
yeah,
very, he's just a part of he's just a part of my life, as is my mother. I want to ask you, I want to pivot a little bit and talk about some more personal things about you because you were so young. And I know I keep saying that, but I do think that you're in your early 20s. And really, at that point in our life, we are carefree. We're trying to figure out who we are. Like we said, we're clubbing, we're doing all of these different things. How do you feel that your brother's death changed your perspective on life, the way you approach life, the way you see the world? Talk to me a little bit about that.
yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing. I think that's sort of the one of the few silver linings of all of this is that you go through a trauma like this, and it really does crystallize priorities. I think it reminds you right away the fragility and the fleeting nature of life to begin with. So not to take anything for granted, and the whole cliche of like if not now, when, get a move on. You never know how much time you got, all that shit. But I think it also reminded me about the quality of the friendships and the relationships that I had in my life. I'm no longer interested in just having surface level relationships with people. Like if you're not gonna be, if especially in those first few years, like if you were not willing to be a shoulder for me to cry on occasionally, you're not in my life. If you weren't sensitive to what I was going through, if you're not serving a purpose, then there's no need. And there were growing pains to that. I think it's hard to let go of people
Yes,
that
definitely.
that don't no longer serve a purpose in your life, or that explicitly tell you that they have no interest in being there for you in the way that you need. It's hard to let go of that stuff. But I found that once I started to embrace the new version of me. I mean, that's the other thing I talk about a lot in my groups is that a lot of my friends had a hard time relating to me because they were trying to relate to a version of me that no longer really existed. And I had a hard time relating to a lot of people because I was desperately trying to hold on to a version of myself that no longer really existed.
I
So
want
it
to
was really
talk
when I,
about I want to slow you down. That's profound, and I think it's really important because it going back to what you said earlier, trying to live in two worlds at the same time. And I think, I think that idea of living in two worlds is very difficult because people, your friends, right? They want you to go out, they want you to have a good time, and it really does for a very long time change us in that way of even what does a good time even mean? I mean,
right,
because that grief process, going from grief to mourning and really pure integration where you really feel like you have completely re-engaged in life, you feel that same depth of joy that you did can take a long, long time.
Yeah.
And I think that what you're talking about now, navigating your way through friendships and who am I in this new world design, can be so confusing, and it can be very scary. That's how I felt. I felt scared. And so how did you manage, because I mean, I've heard everything from the big blowouts with family members and cutting people out and doing all of the things. Other people, friendships just sort of fall away and continue to,
Yeah.
right? It can continue to over the next decade of your life. What was that experience like for you? Did you just sort of cut people out? Did you just walk away? Like, what was that experience?
Well, first of all, it's really easy to cut some people out. Some people make it really easy. Some people, sometimes there's an incident where, they just don't call you back afterwards. But sometimes they just stop calling you back. There's a lot of it's pretty easy, to be honest. Not a lot of, tense moments where it's like, well, screw you then. Not a lot of that. It's mostly, you know, like a sort of like every time something like that would happen, it would be like reliving, like another whole little loss.
Yes,
It's
thank you. That's what I was trying to get to, those secondary losses that we do
yeah,
not think about.
it's like, I'm alone, and now another door is shut. I'm further alone. Is what a lot of that felt like in the beginning, especially with friends who just didn't get it, and there were a handful of people who I had to have some real conversations with about what they had said was inappropriate, or, I was not good at making these things teachable moments. They were, I always say, like, I always leaned into, I don't know if I can, I made them fuck you moments in a lot of cases. It's like,
Yeah.
but, you know, I, I also wasn't giving people an opportunity necessarily to be better. It was like I've talked about this in my group a lot about how I get I was angry and resentful at friends of mine for not being able to give me what I needed when I also didn't tell them what I needed. Not exactly fair to hold them accountable for not knowing. It's not like I knew either. I didn't really have, so, I was no good at recognizing really what worked in the beginning. I was very good at recognizing what did not. And so it's hard to come at people from such a negative standpoint when you don't have any solutions. You just have, like, nitpicky things of what they did wrong, but you don't give them any opportunity to be able to do better. So I've gotten better at that, I think, at being able to articulate what I need, or what, or and ways that people can be there for me. I've gotten better at talking about it. The vocabulary that I have for it now is a lot wider.
I think that that is really beautiful. And what I wanted to say about that is that I think, I talk often about what it means to hold space for people's grief because it's uncomfortable, right? That's why people don't know what to say or say something that you feel like you just want to hit them, right? Because it's not
Yeah,
helpful. And really, it's because, and I say this all the time, like the one truth that we all have is we're all going to die. And it should drive all of our decisions. But instead, none of us are prepared to die. And so then all of a sudden there's a loss and it's like, oh, what do we do now? Like it happens all over again. And it's just perplexing to me. But what I do know is what you said, nobody knows what to do. The bereaved doesn't know what to do. The person who's trying to support you, if they've never been through the experience, has no idea what to do. And sometimes, like those fuck you moments, that sometimes it's just this space of we can't be in this pain, and so we're going to separate.
yeah,
And what I want to say to listeners is that, everybody needs time to heal. And I think sometimes we're like, I'm going to close that door. And it's okay to reassess as we heal, to reopen those doors to people that we have loved and people that maybe we closed off. That, healing and learning takes time for all of us. And people who have not experienced a deep, significant loss simply have no context. They do not understand
right.
what to do or what it feels like. They just know that, hey, you're a real bummer to be around, right? Because you're such a downer. But the
Yeah,
person who's down also doesn't want to be that downer. And so you feel inauthentic. So what does the bereaved do? They also close the door and they just want to go off and retreat and not be around anyone, because it's exhausting to
Yeah.
try to take care of other people's discomfort around your own grief. I mean, think about how exhausting that is,
I mean, that's
right?
really what it is. We bend over backwards to try to make other people more comfortable.
Right. Right.
It's like, what is that?
Right. And
I'll
it's
tell you this, this is one of the jokes that I do sometimes, is about how, being able to make other people really uncomfortable is not the superpower I envisioned having when I was a child, but it is a superpower that I possess, and I try to use it for good.
yeah, and I think that it is in that deep discomfort that it's all of us just dancing around something that still is so taboo, and it's how do we make space for grief?
Yeah.
That's what this is about.
So
And
the
that's
two things, I'd say the two big turning points for me. The first turning point was, I guess it was like 2 or 3 years after Russell died, was when my parents and I started the foundation. So we started doing this fundraiser every year, and being able to do the fundraiser was huge, because it meant that when we told the story about Russell, his death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new story. So the money that we've raised, and the stuff that we've done in his name, has taken the focus off of his death and onto his life, I think. And being able to talk about what we do in his name has been really helpful in not having to have it always be focused on the grief or the death.
and I love that. And because that's that integration. That's what
Yeah.
I'm talking about. When true mourning happens, true integration, it is where you now have it completely integrated this loss into your life, and it becomes a celebration of this human being that you had this deep honor of spending 21 years with, right? That's the shift.
Yep.
That is the big shift, so that his birthday doesn't become this super sad day that you dread every year, but it's a day to celebrate his life, right? And
It's funny.
that, go ahead.
Russell's birthday is New Year's Eve. So it was
Yeah,
just the other night.
just had it.
And
Wow, New Year's Eve, that is wild. That's
right?
wild.
Yeah,
Yeah. Like the whole world is celebrating, Russell.
exactly. Well, that's the attitude that Russell took. When Russell was like 3 or 4 years old, he had gone to bed, and then, he woke up because of the fireworks. He came running out of the bedroom. He's like, "Is it time for more presents?"
No, it's so great.
So, there were a few years, the first few years after Russell died, we didn't really know how to do New Year's. We were, the first few years, we definitely did not do it properly. But then we started doing a party at my parents' house, which we've done for over a decade now. And I came to the realization, like, there was a part of me at the beginning where I thought, oh my God, all my New Year's are going to be ruined now. But it's the opposite.
Yes.
I would not get the number of people to come out and celebrate his birthday with me if his birthday was any other day of the year.
I just talked about this on another podcast episode where I was telling somebody how much I love February 14th. That's the day my brother died.
Wow.
And they're like, how can you, I dreaded it, of course, for the first few years, right? Just like you did. And he died on a national holiday too. And of course it's about the heart, right? And mine was broken and all the metaphors. And then it was like, the big things in my life I've launched on Valentine's Day in honor of him, right? I
Yeah.
had my book come out, my publisher worked with me. And so now it's like his birthday, it's right before Thanksgiving, and the date of his death, it's celebration now. And
Yeah.
and we can make that pivot. And it's an intentional pivot. How do you want to focus? What do you want your focus to be on that day?
Well, the other thing also, I mean, the way that we do our party, everybody there knows the deal. So if I do have a moment where I break down and have some tears, it's not out of the ordinary. It's not unexpected, and it's not inappropriate.
Right.
I have the people there who get it,
Yeah.
and it's very freeing, and to have that. It's I have found that in the moments where I let it out, the being able to sort of let the grief and the sadness wash over me fully, lean into it.
Lean into it.
it passes faster than if I was repressing it or trying to push it down or, pushing it off. At least that's how
Yeah.
I feel about it for myself.
And but that's just true. I mean, that's just true about energy, anything, and that's why we have all the cliches, what you resist persists, and that is very
Yeah.
true with anything, right? And I agree, and it is about allowing the energy to flow, whatever it is we're feeling to allow it. And that is what I mean by leaving space,
Yeah.
right? Because I think that we do lots of things, we can become stuck in it, we can become that negative experience, or we can skate over it so that we repress it and it comes out in a whole bunch of different awful ways that we don't enjoy, or we can allow ourselves to literally immerse ourselves in the emotion and do what we need to do to get to this place that we're talking about now. Of course, it's been many years for both of us. My brother died, like I said, in 2014. So this February will be the 10-year mark. But
Wow.
I can say that it took me a solid five. I wrote a book for 3.5, but it took me a solid 5 years, I think, before I felt like I was doing a true integration of that loss into my life. It took me a
Yeah.
while. It was pretty
Yeah.
hard. It was a pretty deep loss.
Yeah. I feel kind of the same way. I think it may have taken, it took probably took more than 5 years.
And
I
yeah,
mean, the, the, the other two big things, I think, like having my support group, TCF really has saved my life in a lot of ways as well. I mean, it's definitely the national conference that I go to every year is one of the biggest events of my year. I get to, that is the place where I feel like I learned how to be myself again.
yeah,
Where I learned, where I really learned about that integration, because it was about I always tell people that the workshops that we do at the conference are great, but we get our best work done at the bar, which is
yeah,
really just an analogy for all the in between times. The
yeah,
socialization is
yeah.
where being around other bereaved siblings for that entire weekend, for that entire period of time, you can't gloss over it, or there's no need to.
Right.
There's
And the
already
friendships probably that you have made,
and
right?
the
The
friendships that you make, yeah,
friendships.
the relationships that you build there are invaluable. And so it was, to be in a space where you can go from laughing to crying and back within the span of 10 minutes is, you know, there's nothing else really like it. And it allowed me to sort of bring that same energy into my life, outside of that. Like I said, also, it's kind of sad to me. It baffles me so much that there are over 500 chapters of TCF nationwide, but very few of them have a siblings group. There are not a lot of siblings groups around the country. There's
There are not. I agree with you. And even at the Center for Grieving Children, we didn't have a siblings group. And,
right.
but I wanted to just say that that also saved my life. The Center for
Yeah.
Grieving Children saved mine. Absolutely 100%. And I also worked with a grief and loss therapist too for a
Right.
year. I needed to call in the troops. I needed help. And, and so I always love to say that on the show, because I think a lot of things come up after a death. It's more than a sadness, guilt. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other things that
Yeah.
can complicate and can prolong our suffering, that sometimes we need some extra help. Okay, we're coming to the top of the hour, if you can believe that, because I can't. I always pull an oracle card. It's a fun thing that I do because I always feel like there's a message for our listeners. So I pulled one while we were chatting, and I'm going to read what it means, because there's always people that need to hear whatever message comes up. And this oracle card is clean it up. And it means which is going to be perfect given what we're talking about. Ever feel so bogged down with emotional gunk that you can't think straight? Could you be surrounded by physical clutter in your home? Also, too much work, overwhelmed? Time to clean house, guys. And I'm going to interpret this. This is about energy, right? You're starting a new year. And we have been sitting here talking to you. Jordan and I have been talking to you about our own grief journey. And so I am going to say this: our energy can get cluttered and mucked up. Grief is a very dense energy. There are many ways that you can clean up that energy. One is infusing humor, getting into a support group. Know if you need help. And so that is all I will say about that, because when you start to free up your energy, you will allow more joy into your life. And I can never stress that enough, ever.
I,
Uh,
I also have to clean out my storage unit this week. There's also that.
Exact, and that, but that also is energetic, right? All of
Yeah.
that stuff. Things can bog us down. Clutter in our homes, clutter in our heart. What is going on externally typically mirrors internally. So somebody out there needs to hear that message today. Okay, last two questions to bring us to a close. First
Okay.
question is, oftentimes after a deep loss, our idea of what self-love means changes. Tell me what self-love means to you.
Oh boy, my mind keeps going to the dirty jokes, but let's see. I talk about this a lot in my groups about how the biggest message that I talk about on my podcast and in my groups is about how important it is to give ourselves permission to do this the way that we do it and to not add extra shame or guilt or judgment on our process. So like it's okay to not get it right the first time or the second time or the 10th time. It's trial and error. We put so much pressure on ourselves to do this the right way, but we don't know what it is. With no experience, we still give ourselves a hard time for being emotional, for being unprepared, for being whatever. And I think a lot of times that stands in the way of dealing with the actual feelings that we're feeling. So it's important to give ourselves the space and the grace to do it the way that we do it and to not beat ourselves up for whatever that looks like. But I think also, you know, self-care, not just self-love, but self-care is so important and it is inherently selfish. You have to be selfish to take care of yourself because nobody else really cares about you the same way that you do. And, we've talked already about how, the lengths that we go to bend over backwards to make other people happy, to placate other people. We should be putting that same amount of energy towards our own wants and needs as well. It's not fair to ourselves to put other people's needs so squarely before our own.
Hmm, I love that. Thank you. And finish this sentence, and this is not a religious question. When I use the
Oh
word
God.
faith, I don't mean I don't mean it from a religious with a religious connotation. Finish the sentence. Faith is.
Hmm. Well, I don't know. I feel like I could probably answer that 100 different ways depending on the time of day that you ask me that. I don't know. I think, yeah, faith is the understanding that eventually things will, I don't know.
I like where you're
I
going with that. Finish that sentence. Faith
yeah, yeah.
is knowing.
I, for me, faith is knowing that tomorrow, the tomorrow has the distinct possibility of sucking less.
That's a bumper sticker. I love that.
I mean, because that's sort of what I talk about in my group a lot. It's the thing that I say all the time is that because we get bogged down in the semantics of some of this stuff sometimes, and I hate the whole idea of like moving on. I like to say moving forward. I don't like the idea of saying that things are going to get better or easier. Things get different. Things change. So I am open to the possibility that tomorrow will suck less because there's so much. It doesn't put any pressure on you for things to go well. It just has to, it just sucks
It's
less.
yeah, that because I used to ask people to finish the sentence, hope is, and faith feels more of a deeper knowing, right? Then hope sometimes feels tinged on luck, but I
Yeah.
think faith is, and I love that. I mean, a play on, the sun will come out tomorrow, right? And that eventually the sun will come out. It just will, because that is the balance of the universe and
Yep.
energy. And it's hanging on through those really dark times. And because those dark times, they can be pretty terrifying and they can feel desperately lonely.
Yeah.
And so we will have, again, guys, we'll have all the links for those of you who've never heard of Compassionate Friends. As Jordan said, there are chapters all over the country, and we
And
will.
there are a number of meetings that are specific to siblings only that happen on Zoom
I
around
was
the
just going to
country.
say,
So,
so it's not state specific because, right? So if
well,
I wanted,
there are local chapters that in person that you can go and seek out. Very few of them have a siblings group active, but there are a handful, and there are no, excuse me, a number of meetings that happen virtually as well. So there's always lots of support available.
Okay, great. All right, super. Last question. Is there anything else that you would like to say to my listeners that I have not asked you?
Well, we didn't really talk much about my podcast.
Yes, please do.
I've been
Talk
doing
about your podcast.
I've been doing my podcast, Where's the Grief, for about almost 9 years now.
Wow.
2015 is when I started it. So and truly, when I started the podcast was when I really felt like I came out as a bereaved person. That's when I was, I think, having my fundraiser and running my support group. Those are all things that I was able to sort of talk about. But once I started doing the podcast, it was a different ball game in terms of how I presented myself. Putting bereaved sibling into my bio was a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Same here.
yeah, and I found that it was combining all of the things, combining my comedy, combining my support group, those ideas of having just a natural conversation with other people who got it.
But you said your podcast is primarily other comedians.
It is mostly comedians, although I
Yeah.
like to tell people it's not all comedians. I do interview other sad people too.
All right. Well, we'll have the links to that too. And I want to thank you so very much for coming on, taking the time. I really appreciate it. And just very quickly, we will have the links, but what is your favorite channel where people find you? Is it Instagram, YouTube? Where can people find you?
Oh wow, that's a good question, I guess. Yeah, I'm on all those things. I don't particularly like any of them, actually. I wish I didn't have to have 5 Instagram accounts and 3 Facebook pages and.
All right. So we'll just have the links. I think you gave me all your links. So
Yeah,
we
I'm pretty sure I
will.
gave you all the links.
Okay, perfect. And thank you. And thank you, my listeners. I love you guys. I hope that you are going to take something from this conversation on your own journey. And remember to clean up your energy. All right, you guys, I love you. And I'll see you all next week. Bye for now.